Well, I want to welcome everyone to today's YouTube channel podcast. If you're listening over podcast, I just want to thank you for tuning in. A couple announcements, really briefly. I'm really grateful for today's guest, and this month here, this the end of this month is really special. I'm going on sabbatical in July. I only can go for July because I'm still working. We're in the season where we're raising our family and stuff. But in July, I will be off the grid. So if you reach out to me over email and so forth, I will not get back with you until August. And so I'm very grateful for this ministry. I just want to also thank so many of you who have subscribed to the channel. The channel, I keep saying it's growing. Guys, it's growing every day, sometimes every minute. And I'm really close to 1,000 subscribers. I want to thank so many of you for subscribing, for liking, for sharing to the channel. It makes it possible, and it also really encourages me to keep doing this work because it lets me know that it's what's needed. So if you haven't hit the subscribe button, please hit it. And I think by the time I come back from my sabbatical, I will be over 1,000 subscribers. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening and tuning into the channel. Okay, let's get into our guests. We have a very special topic with a very special guest who's very, very qualified. Suzette has been married for 29 years to the love of her life, Andrew. They have 2 loving adult children, a son-in-law, and she is Nana to her 4 beautiful grandchildren. Suzette serves as a women's ministry leader and part of the senior leadership team with the Milestone Churches in Toronto, Canada. She is the chair of the Race Relations Task Force of the ICOC Teacher Service Team. Suzette is the executive director of the Murray McKinnon Foundation, responsible for the overall strategic direction and operation of youth in conflict with law mandates. She has been a part of a counseling team working with violence against women, children, and youth. She's a qualified mediator and trainer of restorative practices and victim offender reconciliation. She has taught related courses as a college professor. With concern for her local community, she is also president of Make Your Mark, a youth leadership enterprise that empowers young girls for change and leadership. These experiences have given her a deeper appreciation and belief for how people can improve the quality of their lives one step at a time. Suzette, welcome to the channel.
Kyle, thanks for having me, and I appreciate that introduction. I don't really like the script all the time. You know, it's you and I, we are people who do our work out of the love and the calling that we have. So I appreciate it anyway.
Amen. Amen. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your conversion and why you went into the ministry?
Okay, so I grew up with ancestral faith. I think like a lot of people in the world, but it was a bit of a warped, misguided, quasi-Baptist faith. The praying Jesus in kind of faith, and I held closely to some teaching, but didn't really have proper instruction or application even in my formative years. So of course, you're then prone to wander, and that's what happened. And my wandering brought me to many parts of my life filled with pain and filled with discontentment. And in 1988, I was converted as a young single parent and found God through an incredible circumstance. So glad that my faith came into being as a younger woman, still a teenager actually, but it undergirded my whole life, and I'm most grateful that God called me into faith while I was learning so much about myself. So what better time to set a trajectory for your life is when you're still in your formative years, and but for the grace of God. So God called me while I was still in a lot of pain and hurts and disappointed with my closest people in my life that really had violated their boundaries in my life. And so it was just the perfect time, as God's time always is. But I knew that I had a lot of work to do on myself. And it took a lot of years, and sometimes it still feels like I'm still in that work. So everything that I do in my life now is really that call to action, to reinforcing the work that I've had to do on myself. And I've personally found great healing in that.
So there's a lot of healing to do.
Yep.
People look for different processes. What I do as a licensed independent mental health practitioner, marriage and family therapist, is I help create a process that people can't otherwise have. I
Mm,
believe that whether it be a licensed professional counselor, marriage and family therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, well, probably less a psychiatrist, but social worker, all of our goal, the entire goal is systemically to help someone have a process they can't otherwise have. What
mm,
we're seeing is that conflict mediation, conflict resolution, restorative practices are incredibly vital in doing the same thing for people. And so why I'm having you on today is I'm a systemic thinker, and I think about restorative practices. I think of
mhm.
circle. We'll get into that here, in our interview as well. But there's different ways to help people have a process they haven't been able to have. We going back to
Yeah,
discipleship being a process.
yeah.
And so why don't you just give us an understanding, a framework for how restorative practice works?
Okay, sure. I love restorative practice. I really began studying that about 20 years ago when it was just a budding social science practice. And it was just the best time to be involved in the field because um, it's it's being tried and it's being tested and it's being proven, and you're seeing the evidence base of it come to life. But in terms of its basic foundation, I think that all human beings are hardwired for connection, just as we need food and shelter and clothes and belonging. Human beings are also need strong and meaningful relationships to thrive. But we're also prone to conflict, and we've seen that since the beginning of time. God wrote about it in His book to show us that. Uh, but what restorative practices is an emerging social science. I would say it's a social science that studies how to strengthen relationships between individuals as well as to their social connections within families and communities, for example. And restorative practices is a concept of finding resolution and healing, which you've already talked about, and I'm sure we're going to get into more of that. Healing with respect to harm done, um, though it's though it's relatively new, I'd say about 40 years now of evidence around social practices. It has its deep roots in the indigenous communities and some parts of the African communities throughout the world, and so I have been practicing these methods, but as much as many other practitioners, but some of the indigenous and African communities have been practicing these methods long before mainstream North America. So I think the credit really goes to them. So we knew that it was an interpersonal conflict type of solution base, really at its grassroots. That's where, restorative practices thrive, the grassroots of the community and family and interpersonal conflict. And in my earlier times of practice, it was in the community, it was with neighbors, it was with bylaw violations, it was with schools, mostly nonviolent offenses are where it also thrives. I'd probably say I've been a part of almost over 3,000 cases of this kind of practice in restorative practices. And as you said, it can branch out into many different types of methods. But it would involve case conferences with parties. So they separate individually initially to really speak about what has occurred, and then the actual mediation or conference would take place. Sometimes even a shuttle mediation, which we mostly do in the legal world, where for some reason parties can't come together. And sometimes that happens. I would say the success rate is about over 80% retention of parties upholding agreements. And that's why there's so much good evidence around it, is because we know that it works.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And to this day, that evidence of succession really holds true. And that's because it's being tried in so many different continents of the world now, and so many different forms of the Europeans are trying it now, and kudos to them for including it in their social services and legal aid and accompanying minor immigrant cases. And they're now going into listening circles, which is something that is new for them. And recently, even with racism and professional development. So, much of what we already have in North America, the Europeans and some other continents are trying restorative practices in many different parts of work. So I'm encouraged to see, as a practitioner, I'm encouraged to see that kind of growth and the evidence-based solution for many entrenched conventional systems that are now trying restorative practices.
I think this is essential. I tell people in my practice oftentimes that what it takes to change experience is experience. And
Mm.
really the technical term would be corrective experiences. But that's
Yes.
true. You have
Yes.
to give people, in order for their brain to think and feel, obviously the left and right hemispheres, they need that handshake. That's what we call experience,
Oh,
when we
that's
put the
good.
thinking and the
Yeah.
feeling. And
Hmm.
what you do is you put people in an environment where they can really connect with people and have those corrective experiences. But those those pathways, those environments, those interactions have to be very well done.
Yes.
And there's an implicit understanding of trauma, I would say explicit, but that you understand, because you're putting people together who are deeply wounded and deeply offended and
Yes.
deeply violated.
Absolutely.
So what you're able to do is something that's very difficult to do, very, very challenging and very risky. So
Yeah.
80% is an incredible number, but it's just proof that, Matthew 18 kind of has its idea of how reconciliation happens.
Hmm.
We do need a way to do that, though. We need a way to keep people safe and their dignity respected as they do this process. But I'm so grateful for the training that you have. It's so needed.
Hmm. Oh, thank you, Kyle. Thank you.
So how would those in the church benefit from something like this? I just brought up Matthew 18, which seems to be,
Yeah.
for a lot of people, this quick fix, like just go talk to this person. Okay, fine, get another, and let's get this thing done. And it's like,
Hmm.
no,
Hmm.
I think there's more of a process than we probably realize.
Yeah, no, you're so right. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Kyle. I have a thing about quick fixes. And it's, when you're trained and you understand the value of processes like you do, you've had years of training in your work, and that's what makes you a good therapist. And so you wouldn't want, for someone to say, oh yeah, just go and, read that book, and then, you're good. So I think, as much as, reasonably possible, I think our faith calls us to uphold people, to be accountable to forgive, to heal. We can't expect that people or groups just forgive and heal without accountability taken for the wrong that was done or the harm that was done, or in some cases an offense that was done. And I love, Jesus, the example as God's wounded healer, because we are all wounded, all of us. I don't think there is not one of us on the face of the earth that would escape being wounded. But yet he set such an example for us to be healers, even through our wounds. So how do you reconcile that? How do you practice that? But Jesus' suffering and his death brought so much joy and life for people. His humiliation brought glory. His rejection brought a community of love. As followers of Jesus, we can allow our wounds to bring healing to others. But you're right, we have to know how to do that. We have to know how to do that well. Because I do think, Kyle, we have the power to bring harm to others if we remain unexamined ourselves. And when the unexamined self tries to fix others or make judgments of what needs to be fixed in certain groups, harm, very dangerous harm can be brought about. So recommending restorative practices to our congregation, yes, I would believe that as much as I've seen it in
Amen.
the world that I do this in, and much of it I've practiced in my in my church relations, and as I've encouraged and led people and inspired people to be faithful. So yes, I do think, and it's not meant to be a kind of a program. I think that's what's, people need to understand. A program, we know, and we say in our work, program doesn't change kids' relationships do, right? It's not programs that bring life to people, but I believe we should be mindful to implement a best practice that encourages harm reduction of any kind. And when it comes to conflict, you can't get around it without addressing the harm.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. You'd mentioned accountability,
Mm.
and that's, when you look at people in the church, there's mistrust issues. I get a lot
Mm-hmm.
of folks over email, people make comments on the videos about bad experiences, hurtful, wounding experiences that
Mm.
they remember now 20, 25, 30 years later. And
Mm-hmm.
the accountability is a part of it. I think also in the church, there's a lot of mistrust about, if we have this conversation, where's this going to go?
Yes.
And so they don't feel like that these processes that we're trying to have or help people have been productive.
Yes.
Again, I got to go back to what you were talking about with the process. There's a process to help move things forward, but there has to be a back and forth. And it sounds like, and we see this, I believe that Matthew 18 is a
Mm-hmm.
guide, right? A community guide for how to help this happen.
Sure.
At the end of the day, you've got to have trained people get into the conversation. And
Yeah.
it's not enough to have someone who's been around a long time. And I
Yeah.
know that might sound offensive to some people, but being around a long time doesn't necessarily make us qualified for the things that hurt.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think restorative practices risk hurting and offending a lot of people with assumptions as to what they think might be a proper solution or a process of solution. So, I think we have to be trained, Kyle, because again, I go back to, if you are an unexamined self, like I was telling you, it took me many, many years to work through some of, my own pain of my past. And although I believed God was calling me to this, I knew that there was just some things in my own life, how I processed pain and harm, that I had to deal with in a way that I wouldn't be, the person wounding others, right? Like I wouldn't be the wounded person that wounds others. And that's a responsibility as much as it is a skill. It's so, harm reduction, you have to have a great understanding of that. You have to have a great understanding of strengths-based models and how we really emphasize using people's self-determinations and people's strengths. And that part of them that incorporates people's own safety plan for reconciliation. And that gives them agency, right? Like it helps them to express
Absolutely.
something in a relationship that's causing them harm in a way that's safe for them. So,
Yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, go ahead.
So, being able to understand that harm reduction and have harm reduction competencies helps, rather than creating systems or more structures or order that draws lines between what's good and what's bad, what's righteous and what's evil. And like you said, just because you've been around for a long time, just because you're the church leader, or you were appointed in a certain kind of position, we know the quality of human relationships is far more influential than any kind of behavioral management system. Those types of things don't help people heal.
What I want to do now is I want to look at a couple subcategories that really apply to the culture and context you and I are talking about. There's an older audience that is listening. And so I just want to make sure that we address some of the issues that they have been facing for quite a while. You've got church hurts. You've got how people feel about evangelism and stats. And I'm just hitting some of these very quickly here. You've got the power structures that have created imbalances, and people really were scarred and wounded by how people used authority. We have people who've been injured by power brokers, who, to your point, have had an appointed position, let's say, and they remember, well, almost with crystal detail, some of the things that were said to them. And so just to kind of, we have a couple different venues before we moved on to offender reconciliation. When it comes to evangelism, church hurts, as I just mentioned, even racial injustice, how can restorative practices apply to those situations?
Well, that's a really, really good question. I do think Mark 12, verse 30 talks about there's no greater command really than for us to love God above all, but love each other as our neighbors and our community like ourselves. When you think about our dynamics in the church, I think the best way that describes us, there's many terminologies that can describe us. We could be an army, a fortress, a kingdom, but I think mostly what we are akin to is the family, and I think we can really benefit from restorative considerations, because if you think of a family, there's so much benefits to, you just don't go around offending each other. You have to have a vehicle to deal with what is healthy and what's unhealthy. And I think restorative practices can benefit all of us, no matter what family you're in, no matter what culture you're in, or what part of the world that you're in. Where you have to ask yourself, where where do you get to just walk away, um, and not address the things in the family? You can't just disappear in a family. You got to come back. So when we leave things left unchecked and undealt with, um, I think the members of the family probably want to disappear at times. Um, and the Proverbs talk so much about, an offended brother wronged is more unyielding than a fortified city. And I think of that in terms of, a dispute. Um, and there are
Absolutely.
many of those types of things in our churches, Kyle. Like, we are really a microcosm of the world. So, it would be far-fetched for us to think that the things that people experience in day-to-day life is not occurring in the church. And so, when I think about evangelism, you asked about that. I do think our evangelistic imperative is one of a foundational element to our ministry and our work and how we grow God's family. Um, when you think about, how we connect with people and helping them to understand God and our relationships with God in the way they understand it, it seems that it would be important that we ourselves are healthy while we're doing that. Um, there's some harsh scriptures, but Matthew 23 talks about woe to you hypocrites.
Yep.
You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And, when you've succeeded, you make them twice as much as sun as hell. I mean, that's
Yep.
harsh. And it's a harsh rebuke from a scripture. But, I think God wants us to know that what we give to others is so important. And he condemns, um, us passing on belief systems built around human regulations um, and religious acts. Everything that we do really needs to take into consideration how people are healed and how we help people heal. So we want to bring people into a healthy family, but we have to have our own self checks. We can't think that because we've been Christians for a long time. We've done the conversion study with people so many times that we know how to do it well. Evangelism goes hand in hand with conversion, right? So if you're talking about converting the life of someone who may have experienced harm or is experiencing a conflict or a traumatic situation in their life, you can't just skirt over that. Transformation is not easy. Learning to become a different person is not an easy thing. So in our church families, I think, yes, there is an oath to forgive. That is the thing that keeps us healing and passing on healing in our evangelism. But we also have to be able to have ourselves checked as to what we're really passing on to people. And so, a checklist is not always sufficient enough to really convert people out of the pain that they may be experiencing or the wrongdoing that they have experienced or, the kinds of harms that have been in their life. So, I know that was a lot, but the point being is that we need to be careful how we've been warned by scripture. And I think we've been warned by time and experience and people and stories we've heard. So, we need to build well
Can you
Mm.
tell us a little bit about the process when it comes to victim offender reconciliation?
Right. Well, so victim offender reconciliation, it's a very specific subcomponent of restorative practice. It is one that is quite unique to offenses, um, and it's one that really I believe is the newer dialogue to have in churches, um, because there are many triggers associated if you're not experienced with it. So some of the terminology is very specific. It has to do more with naming an offense, whereas in restorative practice, you more focus on the harm. And yes, you name the offense, but in victim offender reconciliation, there really is a victim and there really is an offender. And it focuses on the victim being the person who was harmed by the offense, and the offender, the person who caused the harm. Um, and, and so the victim offender reconciliation, mostly used, Kyle, really in the criminal justice system because, you know, the types of offenses are so grave. And it focuses on rehabilitation of offenders through a reconciliation process. And I've done this for many years with people who are in prisons, who are wanting to make amends with those who they've caused harm with. In many cases, it was atrocious and brutal offenses, and sometimes their offenses took people's life and ended in fatality. And so, I mean, serious harm caused. But I think you're right. You know, it feels like what we're kind of embarking on now in some of our conversations, whether it be about hurt that has persisted for so long, it has the potential to feel that unjust and feel that victimized, and so, you know, we try to not throw around those terminologies too much because I do think, you know, we have to be careful to not trigger people and wanting to label situations and create buzzwords that ignite or spark conversations. But there is clearly an offender and there is clearly an offense. And we understand that in all likelihood, even the offender, they too may have been a victim in some degree or another. So instead of thinking of ourselves as clear victims or clear offenders in the church context, I think it's beneficial for us to appreciate that when we come to have these conversations, even if it's the minister as the offender, and these are some of the conversations I've had too, is, you know, the minister, my church leader, as the offender. But then he or she has a victim of either a circumstance or a victim of a circumstance system. So maybe it's a way of thinking, maybe it's, you know, we have to give people the benefit of the doubt as to what their experience is. But I do think, Kyle, we do need a way for people to process the harm that they have experienced, and you know, I think about our church history and how much we've gone through, and some of the challenges that some of the challenging times, and acknowledging what we've been through as a church, and even admitting there were goings on that, hey, I was taught to do this, or I was instructed to do this. Even when there's those kinds of real scenarios, this doesn't diminish them of guilt per se, because there's still impact. There's always impact. But it doesn't, there's at least a pattern that we can say that says, hey, this is something we've all inherited, and we have to find a way to talk about it, acknowledge it. And so it's all about acknowledging. And once we've been able to acknowledge that, what has happened, what has occurred, then we have a chance to come out from under it. But if there's no acknowledgement, Kyle, you can't come to the table with a as a participant. And both restorative practices and even victim offender reconciliation, both of them have the premise that there is acknowledgement of the harm that has been caused. And so without that, you can't really get very far.
That piece about the acknowledgement goes hand in hand with accountability,
Yes, it
right?
does.
So accountability is, hey, look, we're on the side of truth,
Yes.
and that's the arbiter. Okay. And so we're over there. And so truth at times does stand in terms of making some indictments about a person's behavior, about where a person's at. And
Yep.
as we stand with truth, we have to make some statements. And
Yes.
so those statements can feel very judgmental or condemning. And this gets into a whole nother heartbleed that a lot of folks have, like even about like disfellowshipping, right? And you
Yes.
think about how churches have really struggled to address the issue of sexual abuse and so forth, which this restorative process goes hand in hand with that as well. I would very much see that as a parallel process. But let me go back to the root, because I think with trauma, we've got to look at the root a little bit more. So you can look at the root or you can look at the fruit. I choose to try to look at the root. One of the issues that I think is lacking, that I think this really speaks to, is we don't really have a process for lament. We don't really have a process for grief. And grief is one of those things that is scriptural. This is part of being an imager, is the ability to grieve. I have people that come into my office at times. Not only do they not have the ability to grieve, but someone has turned off their tear ducts. There are situations that have turned off their ability to think and feel at the same time. And so, when you look at people's ability to lament, it's at different points. When we baptize people, we baptize a temperament and a psychological profile all in one. What we know is that this person has an incredible desire to make Jesus Lord, and they're willing to swear their allegiance to Christ. That being said, Scripture is full of people who have incredible deficits. Now, we are at the top of that list. But one of those things that culturally that I think we're responsible for is that we have not created a culture that has the capacity for lament. So rewind a year ago, what happened with George Floyd? All of a sudden, you see these forums that are similar to a little bit of what happened in 03. You see the letter come out. And so these forums, some of them did not go well. I think some forums that have attempted lament, and in a public sense, there's been a public venue, could have used some of the principles from restorative practices. I think that would have saved both them and the minister and the member.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And that's because one of the essential components of restorative practices is acknowledgement. And without acknowledgement, you don't, it's like you don't give people the license to lament. You don't encourage people to be able to express themselves and to feel like their experience has been validated. And so, it's like, in our Canadian context right now, Kyle, we are talking about the impact of the residential schools that it had in the Indigenous community. And as we come up on Canada Day, it's like, how could we even celebrate Canada Day when Canada has been such a violator of these people's loss of language, their loss of culture, their loss of family, and until we were able to, the government, and I acknowledge that at least now they're coming around to doing that, saying, I'm sorry. I felt shame and humiliation just hearing your suffering. I'm deeply conscious of how sacred this was for you. And I know that you need healing. I need healing. Until we really come into that world with people in the acknowledgement phase of restorative practices and victim offender reconciliation, saying, I confess to God my failures. I failed you in this relationship, in this dynamic. And I need healing too. Unless we can do that, you cut off the permission for people to do that, especially the ones who have experienced the harm directly.
Yeah, I think that, so one of the things that again, trauma looks at the root. When I look at how people, I just recently did a call with someone and we talked about how ministers really for a long time weren't even allowed to do sabbaticals. That's just new. Like
Oh,
Sabbath
yeah.
culture from
Yeah.
minister all the way down to member has not been authorized. We've been in go mode. As I've said many times, by the year 1990, there were over 500 mega plans to evangelize the world by the year 2000. Now, 2000 happened, Jesus didn't come back. However, conservative churches in the 70s and 90s, you see these pushes we were a part of. The point is that when you look at the systemic picture of what drove it, it's bigger than us. Great example would be the Great Commission churches. Great Commission churches probably were about 10 years ahead of our movement in terms of putting a letter out and formally apologizing for abusive growth practices and power structures that were really damaging and so forth. When you look at their letter and how they outline, it's very, very similar. There were many different pockets of folks who wanted to get to people and evangelize people. And part of that comes from a zeal, a very earnest zeal to evangelize people. And there's a lot of movements that really respect that. The problem is, in the wake of that, what we see is that people developed associations that were inappropriate. So for example, I put an article out on one of my blogs talking about repair versus repair. And this idea of repair isn't just about getting two things to go back together. Repair is about finding the right two things. So repair means right pair. The two things that should have gone together in the first place, because what trauma does, a little bit of a commercial spot for my folks here for a moment. Trauma gets things to go together that shouldn't go together. And things that should go together, trauma breaks apart. So now, and especially what trauma does, is it creates those associations that become overdeveloped and obsolete. So when you look at how people develop associations with evangelism, when you develop associations with being a small group leader or, some sort of leader, there's these associations that were inappropriate, but they're hard to tear apart. They're hard to heal and mend. What's even more challenging is to find the things that should be paired together to begin with. And I feel like what this process really does is this process helps people find healthy associations. It helps people find corrective experiences that they can have in order to heal. Without that, it can't happen. Again, it takes experience to change experience. And it feels at the heart of what you've learned is experience. You create the conditions that allow someone to have an experience. And you've done that, it sounds like, over 3,000 times. That's a lot of times.
It's a lot of times. It's a lot of years. But I love what you're saying, Kyle. And I appreciate you bringing the trauma lens into restorative practices. And I really believe it has a place. It has a very real place. Because when it comes to hurts, and in this particular context, as we're talking about church hurts, when wounds are not acknowledged, people carry them. And like you said, unless the trauma practice shines that light and breaks up things that shouldn't be together, well, people will carry them, and it'll latch on to them forever and ever until there is a process that brings the acknowledgement. And if that does not occur, it's like, it is that license that's to say, yes, I am here and I am willing to be here. And this is not just about me saying sorry to you. This is about me hearing the experience that you had from what my action did. This is about me hearing what it has done to you, how it has affected your thinking, how it has affected your disposition. It's about me understanding, how it has affected you and the people in your lives. So it goes deeper than apologies, and that's what acknowledgement does. And so without that, we really gloss over. And I think we're so good at glossing over because we have another agenda. And
Yep.
that other agenda, as significant and as important as it may be, scripturally based sometimes, it gets in the way of creating true healing in the time that people need that for. And so it's so important that we slow things down. And the analogy that my husband uses, because he's also a practitioner, and he says it's like, you're in a museum and you're just bumping around, you're knocking yourself around. There's glass, there's valuables, there's precious items, and you're just carelessly knocking them around, but someone is behind you sort of picking up the pieces of those precious artifacts because they care about them and it's theirs, and it's a priceless thing for them. And you're like, oh, it's just glass, it can be fixed, it can be, it can be put back together. Or you dismiss the value of that experience in the opportunity to learn about what is important to a person. And so restorative practices is that it acknowledges what is precious, so precious to that person. And they'll be able to find out, oh, it belonged to my great grandfather who's no longer alive. You wouldn't be able to find out some of those things if you're just quickly glossing over and creating other structures and systems and orders to fix things, rather than looking at opportunities in where in our churches we can grow together and heal together and become really the people that God wants us to be in really addressing real harm.
One of the things that I want to get into that will kind of bring us in a little bit for a landing is this idea of voice.
Mm.
Okay. So I think some people are under the impression that if I give somebody a seat, that's the same thing as giving them a voice.
Mm.
There's a difference between giving someone a seat and giving them a voice. So in therapy, typically what I do is I have to create the space for somebody to have something oftentimes trauma has never allowed them to have. Notice how I sort of externalized or renamed the problem. I like the problem to be the problem. Otherwise, we can't solve it. So when we make the
Right.
person a problem, it's very difficult to heal because that's where the goalpost is. And so I like to make the trauma the problem, and trauma takes away our voice. I remember when I really started getting into treating trauma, complex PTSD, DID, really, really horrible, like you were saying, the unspeakable trauma, big
Mm.
T,
Mm-hmm.
that stuff that shouldn't exist.
Right.
I remember I really started working with people, their body, but also their voice. What I
Mm.
would find is we'd be mid-processing or whatever, their
Mm.
ability to vocalize was a part of what was interfering with their ability to process their trauma. So
Mm.
oftentimes something I always ask, "Hey, what's going on in your body or whatever?" "Well, it's kind of in
Mhm.
here, my chest, my throat." And you wouldn't most people think this is jargon or psychological babble. No, it's not. A
No.
lot of people, their voice is a part of the trauma. The lack of the voice
Yeah.
is a part of the trauma. And here's the thing about trauma. With trauma, it's not just about what happens, it's about what happens next. Part of why I think restorative
Mm.
practices are so important is because what you're gonna help someone do is you're gonna help them to own and acknowledge what wasn't
Yeah.
owned and acknowledged. There's a lot of people, they're open
Yeah.
about their trauma or their abuse, and right after that, it's invalidated or it's dismissed, which
Mm.
in the world of trauma is just as, if not more injurious to that
Mm.
person's narrative and their wound than the trauma itself.
Oh my. Oh
It's
my.
yes. So that restorative
Yes.
juncture that you have, that
Yes.
you're positioned in is unbelievably important because part of, again, giving people a voice. They don't
Yeah.
just get a
Yeah.
seat,
Mm.
they also get a voice, and that's very difficult, and I think
Mm.
that's part of it. Let me hang on to this idea of voice for a moment.
Love it. Love it.
What
Mhm.
encouragement, this is a tough one, so I'm no slow pitches on this one. What encouragement do you have for the next generation of women in the church as it relates to this idea of voice? Because there's a lot of women who want to be
Mm.
godly, submissive, they want to be an incredible partner, not just to their husbands, but to leadership. And yet, we also need for their spiritual gifts to be honored and used, right? And that
Oh
creates a
my.
dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Can you just speak to folks who want to have a especially our females who want to have a voice in a biblical sense? What encouragement do you have for
Mm.
them?
Oh, wow. Well, I really thank you for asking that question, Kyle, because, I think when it comes to women, um, uh, actually, first of all, I'm kind of stuck in what you just talked about with the voice thing
Yes,
because
please comment on that, please.
it's just so it is just so real, and I'm so glad that you're having um, places that we can really grow in our church knowledge and experience and skills to validate and to hold sacred, some of these things, because the physical response is, we haven't talked about that yet. The physical response of people in trauma or that is in intractable conflict is 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 paralyzing. It's just paralyzing. Um, and it's anything from adrenaline to the heart racing, like you said, the hyperventilation, the heightened sensory perception, um, that unless we as the examined self, the healer, the real healer, um, help them by acknowledging what has occurred and give them permission to be emotional and to express these things, because in conflict, when people are going through especially intractable conflict, the emotional response is, you go through these stages of the impact stage where there's shock, disbelief, denial, the recoil stage where there's anger, fear, guilt, shame, and those things are carried in people. And then hopefully what we hope people to get to is the reorganization stage, where the there's a new equilibrium, right? There's an equilibrium that is established where it's different and it's refreshing and it frees you up and it gives you that voice and it allows you to be there with agency and with representation and with healing and with joy and with presence. So very, very, very important. And speaking of presence, that question that you just asked, I think the next generation of women are a shining light. Um, we here in Toronto passed the baton in our leadership, and that's one of the transitions that we've recently made. Um, the majority of our church right now is led by the next generation of men and women undergirded by us as the earlier generation that is supporting them. And I'm so proud of what we're seeing come out of them. I'm proud of what we're seeing come out of young women and their curiosity and their adventurous spirit, and they're wanting to have a voice and wanting it to be meaningful and wanting to really not just have a voice that just gets to say things, but be able to put things into action. And I get the strife of that, and what women feel like they're running into right now with the contradictions in their minds of do we speak, do we not speak, should we submit, should we stay silent, and recently there's been a lot of writing on that recently. Some papers and in the book, which I was able to contribute to, Bible and Gender, and some other women who have written some books. Jeannie Shaw has also just written a book on that, and Glenn Giles has just written a paper. And there's many things that are out there for us to grab a hold of. But I think my advice to women in these times is, as much as you want to be assertive, and I think, as much as the Spirit will allow you to, you have to find the balance between being assertive and being, having that edge. I kind of call it find a right demeanor that allows you to, for people to embrace you. Be mindful of that demeanor and your self-governance spiritually, right? That self-control. Be mindful of it, because I think today's culture will feed you a narrative that says there's only one chance that you get to get ahead, and that is to be, harsh and pushy and edgy and really aggressive. And I don't think that is what the Lord wants. I don't think that's what he's asking women, but I think ultimately he wants us to be fruitful women in our lives, and he wants us to be women who are called to be his daughters and his bride, and to express his love and how cherished we are, and so that we can do what we do and speak the things that we need to speak unashamedly, confidently, with his love, and we can smile and we can reflect Christ. But the things that we, I think, position ourselves in, I've always taken the view, Kyle, that my advocacy really should help the voices of others, as opposed to it's just my voice.
Correct.
Entirely. And so, if God has gifted me as a woman to somehow be a conduit and a channel to those who do not have a voice, that's what I want to be able to do. That's what I want to be able to. I see the fruit in that, and I see the wisdom in that. But if we find ourselves just always speaking, and it's just for ourselves, and it's not to lift up the voice of others, then it's, as the Bible says, it's a bit of a resounding gong. And I, as a woman, don't even want those voices representing me as a woman.
And as a woman of color, which is another piece to this that is profound.
Absolutely. And because I am so acutely aware of the value of that position, the people that I work with have authority. They're, much of them have great power and wealth and success, and have government platforms. So, I'm not going to, as God's daughter, in all of who I am as a woman, as a Black woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a daughter, as a wife, as a mother of Black children, I want to be able to represent that in a way that authentically represents me. And that's not, I don't need to be, take on, a man's agenda for that. I want to be able to assert myself with the blessed qualities that God has given me, not desiring to be any more or any less. And so, I think women like Esther in the Bible, her time came in the time that it came. And she wasn't trying to be, shouting from the palace what her agenda was. When her time came, she was speaking for the voices that couldn't speak. And, what a tremendous example of being God's daughter in the right time, in the right place. And so, biblical women, daughters of the Most High, absolutely should have a voice and absolutely should use their gifts and talents with demeanor, with respect, with, reflecting the inner qualities that God has put in them, not necessarily the external pressures and culture of our day that could really get in the way of God's plan.
Well, so a couple things. I feel very passionate on this idea. First of all, First Peter specifically says that women are co-heirs. And in fact, if I'm not, my wife, Christy, if we're not on the same page and I'm at fault, that interferes with my prayer. Like, this is significant.
Yes.
Co-heir with Christ. So we're co-heirs, which blows my mind, the fact that we're co-heirs with Christ. But you and I, as a female and a male, we are both full status co-heirs in that, number one. I think number two, I think that our understanding of how Paul was writing culturally back then, and again, there's tons of papers out and so forth like that, but Paul had women, Paul empowered women. I could go on and on and on. I'm huge on helping women's spiritual gifts be maximized, not just utilized. There's
That's
a difference,
awesome,
right?
Kyle.
Seat versus a voice.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that because I don't think we can get this thing done without the women. I don't.
Amen.
And I'm going to continue to push this because my life has been positively benefited from women's achievements, even theologically. I think about Sandra Richter. She wrote the Epic of Eden. I think about Karen Jobes. She's an incredible Septuagint expert. I think about Ellen Davis, her work on the prophet. So on and on and on. And I just look forward to females continuing through the Spirit of God contributing. I do say demeanor is important because I would say demeanor is important regardless of gender, number one.
That's right. Exactly.
The other thing that I think, I'm going to take a passage that Paul used for parenting, but I'm going to apply it here. Paul says, don't exasperate your children. I actually just wrote a blog on this a couple weeks ago about the idea of training your child in the way they go, and the way they should go. And when they're old, they won't depart from it, and how we misinterpret that. Essentially, it's an admonition. It's calling us to be good parents. Regardless, that idea that Paul talks about in Colossians, in Ephesians, that the word for exasperate, what it means is don't strip your children of their motivation. Don't put them in a situation where they feel like they can't win. God does not parent that way. Very similarly, I want to make just a light application here. We have to be very careful to not do the same thing, I would say, for people who've been marginalized. They already, through life circumstances, feel marginalized. The worst thing we can do is to now put them in a no-win. Because again, as fathers back then, also now, we can strip people of their motivation. We can set a rubric, we can set a bar that people can't reach. We can demand things of people, but then they can't use their spiritual gifts, you name it. The point is that I'm not interested in that. God's not interested in that. I really don't think many churches are into that either. I just think that
Hmm.
there's a lot of fear because things are changing, and
Hmm.
there's a lot of change happening, and we've been through a lot
Yeah.
as our planet has been through a lot in the last 18 months. Point is that my goal is to for women to look at the kingdom and say, you know what, I'm a co-heir. Biblically, I'm a co-heir. Can't argue
Hmm.
that. The other
Hmm.
thing is that they don't just have a seat, they have a voice. I'm not
Hmm.
interested in creating a no-win, because what's going to happen later is you're going to have this chain effect. And now all of a sudden, again, we can get to the root of the fruit. You get to this chain effect later. People protest when they lose their ability to advocate,
Yes.
when they
Yes.
lose their agency, their advocacy, as you were mentioning earlier. We can't, our role is not to take that. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
No, it's a
Get into
great
that.
soapbox. It's a great soapbox.
It's just the truth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we cannot get this thing done without our co-heirs.
You
In
know, I'm grateful to be in a marriage where my husband allows that, allows me to be a co-heir with him and not muzzle that, just what you're saying. It's like this is what God has gifted us. It's what God has gifted him to me and me to him. And he's been an incredible model for living that out with me and in our marriage. Um, I'm a part of things and initiatives in our churches that he is not. And he's like, Hetty, if this is what you want to do, you're passionate about this, great. You go right ahead. I'm going to support you. Right now, we're a part of the task force committee, of which I'm the chair, and he's a member of the chair, or a member of the committee, and he lets me lead that committee along with the other men who are there. And so I appreciate when we see it being modeled by good men, and I think we just need more of that, Kyle. We need more men like you, um, young men who understand that we are co-heirs and women have a part to play, and without them being able to do that, it shuts down their perception of what God has assigned them in life to do. And so and we talk about this all the time. I think husbands and wives should talk about it a lot. And I think single women need to talk about it with men around them, and not be afraid to. And I'm sorry for the women who are experiencing the kind of pain where they can't. And I just want to encourage you to find an avenue, find a way, look for models and latch on to them and allow them to lift you up. And I think with time, good will come. Good will come. I think we have to be patient as we change. Change is important, it's essential, and but I think the women of even my generation, women certainly of the next generation, have so much to offer, and I think we will see God using them in ways that we would never expect.
I
That's
appreciate you
right.
so much. Let me ask you quickly,
Oh, me too,
what
Kyle. I
what
appreciate you.
what are some upcoming announcements that you'd like to share with us?
Mm. Well, I think specifically for me, being chair of the race task force has been just an incredible honor. And as I said, I feel very grateful for the men and the women who have allowed me to take that position and really utilize the things that I do in my work and my community and some of the practices there. We've done some great things, and for those who don't know, we do have a race relations task force that exists, in our churches. It is a subsection of the teacher service team, of which I serve with a couple of other women. And in the last year, since the task force was struck, we created a charter. We've created events that we wanted to be able to launch to the church. In Black History Month in February, we were able to launch 2 weekends of racial justice in the church, of which, Kyle, you were one of our speakers, and we were so blessed to have you there. You brought a great lens of trauma and racial history, which many people commented on was just incredible. So yeah, I think from that event, those 2 events, it then launched. Many of our task force members were able to be speakers at the Teleos conference and be able to share even further and shed light to oppression and anti-oppression and some of the racial injustices that we are seeing that is right here with us. And so I think we did a great job in the first round. We'd like to, in the next round, really take it deeper and go to perhaps revising our charter, looking at that next level of the fight for injustice in our churches, because we recognize it's not just the head knowledge. The battle is really an internal one. And we want to be able to help people with an experience that is very real, that allows people to speak their story, tell their story, and that their story reflects who they are. So we hope to become more immersed in the next round, examining, like I said, some of those stories. We want to create a lexicon that may be helpful to people. And I think in the next season, really help to bring church leaders and help to, people who have roles and responsibilities in our churches that can really help to push these principles much further into the church, the heart of the church. And so I just really so proud of my team, Steve Kennard, Steve Staten, James Becknell, Joey Harris, Andrew Lewis, my husband, and Robert Carrillo. It's just been a great team, and I look forward to sharing more with our churches to benefit from this task force, this small task force. So we just ask for your prayers as we continue to really look and dive deep into more immersive experience for our churches, and that many will benefit from that.
Well, thank you for your hard work. It's a sacrifice. You have, as I read your bio, you have a very full life, and it demands your full attention. And so to do
Yeah.
more and to do the right things, I think you've landed well. You've picked your battles really, really well, and I think it's a worthwhile
Oh,
battle. And
thank
it was
you,
an honor.
Kyle.
It was an honor
Oh,
speaking at those conferences with you earlier this year.
oh, you
Great.
were awesome. You're awesome. And really, as we think about doing it again, Kyle, we'd be, honored that you would come back again and further help us to understand how trauma, racial justice, some of these things, restorative practices, as we're talking about, really are not just needed in our church. It's essential for life and godliness, really. That's what it's about, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I am so grateful that you've stopped by today. I know that you had a busy day and things are really busy, but I really appreciate you coming onto the channel today.
Oh, you are amazing, and thank you for having me. It's my honor to be here, Kyle, and the great work that you're doing is just phenomenal. And I'm a subscriber, and
Yay.
I'm spreading your channel to those in my sphere of influence in the church and out of the church. So I hope it continues to grow for you.
Well, I'm going to say to you that the same thing I say to all my guests, that we are with you and God is for you, my sister.
Oh, thank you, my brother. I appreciate you. I
All right.
appreciate being here.
And if you've listened the entire length of this video, I just want to give you a special sticker, but can't. So just know that I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for listening, for subscribing, for sharing, for liking. And I am so grateful that I have your attention and your heart and your respect and your trust, and I want to honor it. And please continue to listen to the channel. Again, in July, I will be on sabbatical, but I do have content next month. I will be having Michael Burns, Joel Peed, and who else do we got? Oh, Jason Alexander. So it's going to be a great month, and I will see you guys next time.